Hello and welcome to MMI Monthly, a podcast sharing public health stories from bench to breakthrough. I'm Thomas Locke. At the height of the COVID pandemic, one trend stood out. Men were developing more severe infections and dying at a higher rate than women. For researchers of sex and gender, this didn't come as a surprise. It's long been shown that women have stronger immune responses and better health outcomes than men across a range of infections, including HIV, influenza, malaria, and TB. In 2016, the NIH recognized sex as a biological variable, a factor that can influence health outcomes. The big question is why. It's thought that a combination of biological and social factors might be at play, chromosomes and hormones on the one hand, and lifestyle and nutrition on the other. So what do we know about the key influences on immune outcomes in men and women, and of their relative importance? And is such a binary approach between men on the one hand and women on the other always useful? Joining me to discuss these issues is Professor Sabra Klein, a researcher at Johns Hopkins who studies the role of sex differences and pregnancy on immune responses. Professor Klein is a fellow of the American Academy of Microbiology and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. She's authored more than 100 peer-reviewed papers and co-edited a volume on sex and gender differences in infectious diseases, now in its second edition. Professor Klein, thank you for joining me. How are you doing?
I am doing well, and it's wonderful to be here with you, Thomas.
Thank you. You've shown that women often have stronger immune responses across a range of infections, including influenza, HIV, and COVID-19. 5-6 years since the start of the pandemic, do we have a clearer sense of what might be causing those differences?
So, the greater or the heightened immune responses in females as compared with males is rooted in biology. And both from data during the pandemic, as well as data, as you noted, from many other infectious diseases, we understand that hormones and sex chromosomes, specifically genes on the X chromosome, are critical at creating an environment in females that enables these immune responses to be greater.
And you lead the Klein Lab at Johns Hopkins. Could you give us a sense of the kinds of experiments and research that you're conducting to try and shine a light on some of those differences?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so in the Klein Lab, we primarily work with influenza viruses, SARS-CoV-2, tuberculosis, and even malaria parasites. We really have diverse interests in the pathogenesis of these infectious diseases, as well as studying vaccines that can help protect us against these infectious diseases. And what our data are showing is that with these greater immune responses in females, this can be both a curse and a blessing. So these greater immune responses, they may lead to faster clearance of an infection. But if these immune responses become too high, the immune responses themselves can cause pathology in tissues, including the lungs, leading to, in many cases, greater disease in females as compared with males. When it comes to vaccines, our data, both in preclinical animal models as well as in translational human cohorts, consistently show that in response to vaccine antigens, females mount greater immune responses and can be better protected against challenge. So we do a lot of this work looking at sex differences, as well as how pregnancy and even aging can shift that balance. So that female advantage that I'm discussing with you in terms of protection, some of that gets lost during the time of pregnancy when there are tremendous hormonal shifts that occur that contribute significantly to changes in immune responses that are necessary to ensure that we don't reject a fetus, but can be detrimental when it comes to a viral infection, leaving pregnant women at greater risk of severe outcomes from many vaccine-preventable diseases, including influenza and SARS-CoV-2.
And to take a step back from your current research and current focus, could you tell the story of how you became interested in this field? What drew you to researching sex differences in immunity? Where did it all begin?
So where it all began was um, I read I read some papers from some evolutionary biologists, including Marlene Zuck, and and William Hamilton, I should say, and they were considering how Darwinian sexual selection may lead to sex differences in the immune system, meaning that based on the factors that increase reproductive success, which are often different for females as compared with males, could the same biological processes that have evolved to impact reproductive success differently for males and females also play a contributing role in sex differences in the immune system and in susceptibility to infectious diseases? So, my dissertation used comparative animal models to put this to the test, and we did, in fact, find that in species where the differences in what causes reproductive success for males versus females, when that's very different, in which maybe animals where only females provide parental care, males just are there to provide sperm and leave, their differences in their immune systems were much greater than in animals that are monogamous, where males provide a significant amount of care, and the factors that contribute to reproductive success are a bit more similar between males and females. We found the differences to not be as great.
I suppose a criticism might be, or a concern might be, that emphasizing differences between men and women might lead to a kind of biological determinism. Do you think that's a fair criticism?
So I've been asked this before. Do I worry that by emphasizing these differences, this might lead to, you described it as determinism, but could it also lead to discrimination is another question that I've been asked. These are biological truths. So whether we study them or not, they're there. So I would argue that one size does not fit all for most treatments, and that by ignoring this, we cannot get at the precision that we need in biomedical sciences and in clinical care of patients, and that looking at sex differences, much like we might age differences, is critical for improving care for everyone.
And you've advocated for a women's health approach. I wonder what that might look like in practice when dealing with infectious disease outbreaks.
I think what this could mean for infectious disease outbreaks, what I would like to see first and foremost is that all data are disaggregated for men and women, to allow us to make that comparison, knowing that there are these differences between men and women. This could then lead to a better understanding, not just of the biology, but I'll give you one example where the behaviors can also impact our understanding, especially during infectious disease outbreaks. So, if we take Ebola virus outbreaks, oftentimes, rates of exposure and death can be greater for women than for men. However, when you look at the cultural behaviors, women in the cultures in West Africa where these outbreaks have occurred are much more likely to care for the sick and the dying. So women have a greater rate of exposure because of this cultural behavioral difference. And by disaggregating and ensuring that we are seeing who's most likely to get exposed, this allows us to maybe take public health measures to help prevent exposure. Maybe it's additional protective equipment. Maybe it's educating certain populations of people about their increased or added risk. Um, so I do think that there can be multiple reasons, both biological, but also cultural and behavioral, for why we need to disaggregate these data and ensure that the public health messaging accounts for these differences.
And how far along do you think the scientific community is in accepting and working towards disaggregation of data and realizing some of these differences? I mentioned before that the NIH in 2016 recognized sex as a biological variable. Did that kind of turn the tide for this area of research, or is there more still to be done?
I think the 2016 requirement that grantees consider sex as a biological variable was an excellent start. I think the real turning point, and you noted this in your introductory remarks, came with the COVID-19 pandemic, where it could no longer be ignored. Men were dying. Men were being admitted into intensive care units and dying at greater rates than women. And we were witnessing this across diverse countries. So it was really cutting across maybe cultural or social barriers, um, comorbidities that all differ in different countries, but it was cutting across this, allowing us to really begin to explore the biology, which we are still trying to do to this day. But I do believe that the COVID-19 pandemic elevated appreciation of the value of sex differences in disaggregation and analyses of data by sex.
And then to finish off, what advice would you give to young scientists or students who are interested in pursuing research in immunology or indeed sex based medicine? What advice would you give?
So, my advice is there is so much work to be done. It is such an open field of study, which is so exciting. It has been ignored for decades. So, we are making up for lost time, and there is no limit to the number of questions that we can ask and the research that can be done considering sex differences in immunity to pathogens.
Perfect. Well, Professor Sabra Klein, thank you so much for your time today. Join us next time on MMI Monthly for the latest science and ideas from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health.